Well, we're talking about sex tonight, young people. That's right. If you would have told me when I was a college student at Texas A&M that one day you will be talking about the most intimate of topics on one of the most public of spaces on campus, I would have said, nah. And yet, we're talking about sex on the front lawn, young people. Not sex on the front lawn, but we are on the front lawn, and we are talking about sex. So I don't know what you came here for, but this is what we're doing. And let me just put this to rest. This choice of location was purely coincidental. It's not trying to make some statement about talking about sex on the steps of the Capitol up here. It just happened to be the location, and I had to think about it. Do we do that? Is that weird? People are going to hear us in the parking lot of Best Buy going, yeah, I need to get a new cord in. Did he just say sex? Yes, he did. I did. But you know what? We're going to do it. And here's the thing that I was praying. Maybe this change of venue will make this conversation more memorable. And I think for some of us, there's some things God has for us tonight. And my prayer is that this night would be a significant marker on your journey as you understand your relationship to God, your relationship with yourself, and your relationship with other people. But before I get into what the Bible says about sex, I don't want to start there, because before we talk about where we should be, we need to talk about where we are. We got to talk about where we've started before we go and talk about where we need to be. And I want to talk about externally the culture you live in, because culture affects us. My wife and I support the education of some kids in Africa, and we write letters back and forth. And I remember the first letter this young man, Bukenya Moses, wrote back to us. He was trying to get to know us, and he said, "So what are you harvesting?" And I was like, "What?" And then as I read his letter, I realized, oh, that's a normal question for him to ask where he's from. Like, it's springtime, we're harvesting over here some crops. What are you harvesting? And I was like, no one's ever asked me that question. And I've never thought to ask someone that question. And I thought, that is a real cultural disconnect. That's so normal for him, but in my culture, that's not normal. And I didn't even see my culture and how disconnected I am from agrarian life until someone spoke into it and gave me a different view. So we live in our culture and we don't assess it very often, but I want to pull the lens back for a minute and just say, what's the culture we're in, particularly as we talk about sex, because it is having an impact on you. And the reality is sex is popular, if you didn't know that. But sex has always been popular throughout history, so that's not new. But the proliferation of highly sexualized images and its accessibility online is new, and it is new with your generation. And we talked about it when we talked about technology last semester. We are in the midst, as a country, in an uncontrolled experiment on you. And we're just now getting data back on the effect that it's having, because your experience is different than your parents' was. So what is going on? Let's start there. And what is going on is we live in a hypersexualized culture. And more than any generation that's preceded you in this country, you have been raised on it and educated by it. A proliferation of sexualized images dominated your growing up years. It's interesting, Dr. Gail Dines, she's a professor of sociology in Boston, speaks about the pornification of young people. And she was talking about the fact that you may have never been to a pornographic site, and yet you are being influenced by it because modern pulp culture is influenced by porn culture. And in an address I heard her give a room full of psychologists, she told them, hey, Details magazine is already on top of this. They had an article entitled, How Internet Porn is Changing Teen Sex. And in it, they interviewed a pornographer. And she said, the girls these days just seem to come to the set porn ready. And she was asking the question, as a studier of sociology, what does that mean? And what it means is the culture has been socializing young girls to be familiarized with a hypersexualization of women from the time you're very young, and you don't even need to see porn to know that. It's happening in pop culture. As you look at magazines, you see in the grocery store, from Cosmopolitan to Vanity Fair, you see a hypersexualized presentation of women. And it's interesting, as I heard this woman give this address, this little British woman, she said, look at some of the images, and she put up one of a woman, and she said, anytime you see an image put out in the culture, they have a reader in mind. This is basic marketing. When you put an image out, they have a reader in mind. And that reader, they're trying to deliver that reader a message. So I think we put up a picture of Amy Adams. Her picture was a little riskier than that one. But this image, she said, take a minute and look at that image. Now think about who's the reader. Who is that message intended for? And what message is she saying with that look and that pose? And then she asked the question, is she saying, hi, Mom, would you like to get some coffee later? Is that what that image is saying? No, who's the reader? It's men. And what's the message? Have sex with me, right? That's the message. And that message is being played out in newsstands and online everywhere you go. And this sociologist asked the question, what's it like for a young man to be raised in a culture where before he can learn to speak, he sees images of women looking at him and offering themselves to him immediately? What does that do to a young mind? What does it do to a child? What does it do to a girl to be constantly presented with that image of femininity? What it does is it leaves young girls with one of two options, either to be overly sexualized or to be invisible. You see it in culture today. You see it in pop culture. Girls are realizing nobody cares what your voice sounds like until they see what your body looks like. And you see that happen a lot with pop singers. They realize that there's either invisibility or overt sexuality, and many of them are choosing this one. And you see it happening in normal girls all over the place. To get attention, I have to be sexual. And if the choice is sexuality displayed or invisibility, what kind of choice is that to a young girl, especially an adolescent where the basic need is to be seen and to be known? She's being given this offer. And I read an interview with a man who was a convicted child molester in prison, and he was talking about how he groomed his young victims, and he said, what you do to them is you tell them that what's most important about them is how they look. And you keep reinforcing how hot they are before you ever make a move, and that's conditioned them that what gets them attention is their sexuality, and then you groom them. And then he said, the culture has largely done this for me now. That this is what's happening to young girls in our culture. And you see it. 7 of the top 10 songs on iTunes are about sex. I went and looked at the top downloaded books on iTunes. The vast majority are about sex. Even the most tame of news sites, if you look at their top clicked on stories, it's usually about someone in a bikini, and it's not a dude. That's the world we're in. And guys, this comes at us with pornography. It comes at you women too, but it comes at guys especially. The average age now of first presentation of hardcore pornography online to young men is age 11. 11. Before you're thinking about sexuality that way, and before you're certainly looking for the kinds of images you're going to stumble onto. And so Mark Regnerus is a professor at the University of Texas. I know. And he wrote a book called Premarital Sex in America, and it's all about you. He's just studying sex among 18 to 23-year-olds. And this is what he found in the most rigorous and reliable study he printed about pornography use. He said that 86% of young men, 18 to 23, interact with porn at least once a month. 86% of men, at least once a month. 69% of women report no porn use at all. So you got 86% of men saying at least once a month, 31% of women saying at least once a month, which is a significant percentage. That's 1 out of every 3 girls. But that's nowhere near 86%. It is still largely a male problem. Just under 50% of men said they watch porn weekly. Only 3% of women say the same. The Huffington Post reported a few years ago that porn sites get more visitors each month than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. That's the world we live in. And the reality is it's impacting us. So Regnerus' conclusion is this. He says, the data is in. The internet is both our sex educator and sexual activity stimulator. While almost everyone will acknowledge that, of course, reality isn't like the images we're seeing, nevertheless, we wonder if it could be or should be. And this is the essence of learning, modeling that's enticing. And so you're surrounded by these images, and you know that, but what are the messages they're sending to you? Basically, I would say 3 messages are being pressed on particularly your generation. One is that sex is casual. One message is sex is no big deal. Whatever. It's just something you do for fun. Like you eat food because food feels good. You rub your bodies together because that feels good. Why are you making such a big deal out of it? Sex is something fun to do, so we do it. So there's a sense of sex is no big deal. It's casual. Where at the same time, you get a message that sounds conflicting because it says, but sex is also essential. Sex is no big deal, but it's a huge deal. You should be having it. No one should put restrictions or boundaries on it. And if you're not having it, that's weird or unhealthy. We had a national speaker come to Breakaway a few years ago, and he said, it's interesting, as I travel around the world, as I'm talking to more and more people, when I talk about people that say, I want to be abstinent until they're married, he said, increasingly, I hear people say, is that because of your religious convictions? They instantly think you were maybe abused and traumatized, that to not be having sex regularly means there's something wrong with you. So sex is no big deal, it's casual, but it's essential, you should be doing it, and if you're not, you're weird. That's sort of the message in the culture. And the last message I really want to hit on with us is that it's primarily physical. And what's happening with the presentation you're getting in images is a divorce of your physical body from your mind and your emotions. That as I look at these people's bodies in images online and in the news rack and everywhere I go, I'm being encouraged, invited to look at their bodies to stimulate mind, but not think about, I wonder what she's thinking about. I wonder how she feels today. We're not called to engage with the heart and the mind of these individuals. We're to separate those things. And I hear it in modern music today because more and more you hear, as there's talk about sex, you hear the pronouns have changed. I want to hit this. I want to get with that. There's no more personalizing of the pronouns. Why? Because there's more and more of a disconnect in our culture between sex and personhood. Right? And you go, well, Ben, I thought this was a talk on sex. Why are you talking all about porn? Because here's the thing. It is impacting the way your generation views relationships. It's interesting. Donna Freitas is a research professor at Notre Dame who writes extensively about sexuality and spirituality, and she did a nationwide research project over the last decade on college students and sex, and she went to 4 different kinds of schools. Private schools that are secular, Catholic schools, public schools like ours, or evangelical schools. And she said evangelical schools, that is schools that are like Protestant Christian schools, she said I bracketed them out. So I'm just talking about sort of your not Protestant Christian-y schools. Just in regular school, she said, as I did interviews among them, as I interviewed college students, she said almost 100% said to me to be in college is to be casual about sex. That college students today have a casual view about sex. And she said, but here was the interesting thing. When asked personally about your views on sex, she said 36% said, my peers are too casual about sex. Isn't that interesting? So she interviewed college students. She found what they were saying is, college students would say, people around college, they're all real casual about sex, but not me. And 1 out of every 3 college students says that. Everybody's doing it, but I don't feel that way. And you're like, well, the you that don't feel that way is about 1 in every 3 people. That's a lot of people. And so what's the point of that? The point is your generation feels a pressure to be sexual. And a lot of it's coming from the media. It's been fascinating, the proliferation of articles about the hookup culture. I don't hear people talk about it as much as I traffic among you. I constantly hear about it from your parents and every Christian minister I know. So when I get called to talk at Christian events about you, they don't even ask me, hey, can you come talk about sexuality in the mind of the modern college student? They say, hey, can you come talk about hookup culture and how it's ruining our kids? Because the assumption is that you've all bought into that you are having anonymous, emotionless, alcohol-fueled sexual encounters on a regular basis, where there's a divorce between your physical body and your mind and emotions. I don't want to have feelings for you. I just want to use your love tonight, right? That's the idea. And some of you are doing that. Many of you aren't. But that's the presentation of college today as I traffic in the world today. There's a pressure on you that you're supposed to be like it's spring break always. And yet, here's the reality of this presentation. It hurts us. It hurts us. This complete freedom sexually, which was a big experiment, mainly your parents' generation. Let's have sexual liberation, this liberation that was brought to you. Because let me stress to this, I'm not shaming you tonight. If you're wondering where this talk's going, where I'm going to go, and so to conclude, shame, right? That's not what I'm going to do. You didn't make your Disney stars become porn stars. You didn't do that. You didn't make the internet. You didn't create this stuff. It was handed to you, and you've been marinating in it. But it has affected you. And the reason why I'm talking about it is because it's affected you. You've lived in this culture, and now you're going to start making decisions of what you're going to pass on and how you're going to relate to us. And so the reality is, it hurts us. It hurts us. The American Psychological Association has been sending out alarms about the sexualization of young girls. It's interesting. Secular sources, not just Christian preachers like me, are starting to go, whoa, 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 whoa. The sexualization is happening younger and younger, and it's having an express damage on young girls' body image. It's leading to greater depression, eating disorders, and an earlier sexual debut for little girls. Why? Because this culture is pressing on them things that are being called normal. So you see pop stars mixing in elements of childhood. And it started back with Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera, where they would dress them in schoolgirl outfits with pigtails that were opened up to be sexual. How broken is that? To moving on to putting pictures of teddy bears and stuffed animals with girls in thongs on a stage. And even now, I was at the mall last week and saw shops dedicated to the lingerie that are marketed to the middle school crowd. Thongs for 7-year-olds. That's the world we're in, and the secular world that was ushering this in is saying, wait a minute, this isn't good. It's conditioning a culture to see children as potential sexual objects. And I don't think that's disconnected from the CDC's research that estimates 1 in 4 girls are sexually abused before age 18. That's the world we're in. And it's hurting marriages. It's fascinating. I read an article recently about the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers. Did you know there was one? There is. Maybe you'll join it someday. Because it comprises the nation's top 1,600 divorce law attorneys. And in one of their most recent gatherings, they remarked on the drastic increase in this over-sexualized image culture contributing to divorce. 56% of divorce cases involved one party having an obsessive interest in online pornography. The president of the association was quoted saying, 8 years ago, pornography played no role in divorce in this country. Let me say that again. 8 years ago, pornography, 0 role in the breaking up of modern marriages. Now, 56% of marriages are saying our marital sexual life and our marital communicative life has been damaged because of the entrance of a sexualized media into the life of my family. It's hurting us, this cultural milieu we're in. And relationally, it's hurting us. The popular narrative I hear all the time is You got to be sure before you marry someone that you're sexually compatible, so you should cohabit. And now the majority of American couples are cohabiting before marrying, even though every study has shown that cohabiting before marrying does not increase the likelihood of a good marriage. It actually drastically increases the likelihood of divorce. And yet you still hear people say, you should test it out sexually first to see if it works for later, because that will create marital stability. When we do the research, it demonstrably doesn't. It doesn't. The sexualization of our culture hurts women. I read a fascinating study recently that is showing there's a direct correlation in young college-age women between the number of sexual partners and rates of depression. And that doesn't start at 10 partners or 20. It starts with 2. That you see where there's an increase in number of sexual partners, there's an increase in depression. Sadness is accompanying this sexual liberation, right? And it's not just that, it's hurting intimacy with us. One study by Dolph Zillman in the Journal of Adolescent Health said prolonged exposure to pornography is leading young men to presume that sexual exclusivity is unrealistic and uncommon, to believe that sexual inactivity is bad for your health, and to hold a cynical attitude about love, affection, marriage, and family. That it's affecting not just a guy's enjoyment in his room, it's affecting relationships with women. And women are beginning to feel that. Because here's the reality, and I wasn't quite sure how to explain all this, but let me try to step into this just to give you a picture of what's happening with us. We have made sex primarily a self-focused act. I'm doing it for me. Pornography does that. It's accessibility and anonymity. It's just me and my computer. What that's done is we've made it a self-satisfying act. And yet here's the reality. Sex is primarily a social act. It's about bonding with a man and a woman. And by bonding, here's what I mean. I researched so many different people that have talked about now the brain science we have behind it. Psychiatrist, neuroscientist Norman Doidge explains it this way. Sex fires your dopamine system. Dopamine is the happy chemical in your brain. And he says when you have sex or when you watch a very explicit sexual encounter online, and have a sexual response yourself to it, that floods your brain with dopamine, happiness chemical, and it creates a neural pathway in your brain where your brain says, when I click on that and watch that, it makes my brain really happy. And so your brain says, I got to do that again, right? Because sex is meant to fire that pleasure center, right? That pleasure center's good. It fires when you eat good food, when you have something good to drink, when you have sex with your wife, your brain says, this is great. You should keep doing this. Like your brain does that. But it also releases the hormone oxytocin, which is a hormone that promotes bonding. Bonding. Because sex is meant to be a bonding experience. It's interesting, anthropologist Helen Fisher says it this way. She said, oxytocin is the same chemical released when a mother breastfeeds her baby. Why? Because that act creates bonding between mother and child. So she said, there's no such thing as casual sex. There is literally, chemically, no such thing as physical sex with no emotional strings attached. Why? Because you don't get to control what your brain does. It releases dopamine that says this was amazing, and oxytocin that says you are bound to this person. Biblically, the Bible just poetically said the two become one flesh. You knit yourselves together more than just physically. You bond with that person or with that thing. And what happens is as that bonding occurs, you crave it. That's why for many of you are not part of the hookup culture of having anonymous sexual activity with random people. But what is common among you is what's called serial monogamy. I date someone, and in our dating relationship, we have sex. And then if we break up, I date someone else, and we will probably have sex as well. But what happens in that is what? As you have sex with that person, Dopamine is being splashed all over your brain. This is amazing. Your mind saying, I got to do that again. And oxytocin's firing in your brain of saying, I'm now bonded to that person. And that's why, and many of you know this, what happens when you break up with that person? You've been firing the same part of your brain that's lit up by cocaine. And so what happens? You go through withdrawal. You've seen this happen with friends of yours, that they break up with somebody, and what happens? A week later, they got the DTs. They're trembling like, I gotta go see him. I gotta go see her. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm driving over there. I'm gonna stand out in the rain saying, I love you. Right? And you literally have to tie them to something. You're like, I'm going to my beloved. And you go, he was a psycho. He's in jail now. Right? They're gonna give you all the reasons why you shouldn't be into him. But you'll go back to an ex you know is a horrible person. Why? Because you're addicted to him. Because you're literally chemically addicted to them. And there's part of your brain that is being suffocated and it doesn't like how that feels. That same experience is happening with pornography in young men. That same experience. And here's the terrifying thing about it. When I counsel students that have drug addiction, one of the hardest things is when you use cocaine, it takes your brain up to 1,000. Bing, that was amazing, but it fries the circuits. And so what is the most difficult thing I've found for people when they're getting off drugs is not only the loss of the euphoria of the drug, it's literally that they sear their pleasure system. So your dopamine levels hit when you have a great meal with friends. When you say something funny and she laughs, bing, little dopamine. When they say something funny and you think, gosh, I have great friends, little dopamine hits, right? But when you've fried the circuits with pornography, what happens is you not only lose that joy when you cut it out of your life, it sears your ability to enjoy the little things. That's why it's killing marriages, because men aren't enjoying the romance of their wives because it's not as extreme. And I'm saying all this, again, not to shame you, because I love you. I just want you to know that's why we're talking about this, because I don't like this. And here's the crazy thing. I read an article that talked about what's happening now with young men is they're seeing an increase in erectile dysfunction in young men because online sexuality is so extreme that sex with an actual woman, it takes longer, is time, and they literally can't engage in the same way. And I thought, that's got to be overstated. And this past month, I've talked to 6 young men dealing with that. It's a problem. It's a serious problem. And the world is waking up to the insidious irony that this liberalization of sex has actually imprisoned us. And by the end, do you know what it steals? The act of sex itself in marriage and your ability to enjoy it. This is hurting us. It's bad. It's not good. Paul said it this way in Ephesians about people that are not walking with God. He says they have lost sensitivity and they've given themselves up to sensuality. He says there's a spectrum. The more you indulge in sensuality, the more you lose a sensitivity. And many of you are losing the joy of romance because of that. And I don't want that for you. And yet here's the reality, and you're like, when's he going to get to the Bible? I'm getting there. But let me tell you a couple more things about you. Here's my hope for you. As much as the culture is pressing sex on you like this, interviews with college students have shown over and over again, you want more than that. Donna Frieda, in her research about hookups, when she interviewed people that do have hookups, have anonymous sexual or making out encounters with other people, she said 41% of them said it made them profoundly unhappy. Words like disrespected, sad, abused, and duped came to mind. 23% were ambivalent. They were like, 36% said hookups were fine. And she said, what was amazing to me is I went to colleges around the country in the United States, the most optimistic group about sexual encounters like that said it was fine. She said they didn't say it was great. They didn't say it was awesome. They didn't say it was amazing. They didn't say it was just like the movies. They said it was a letdown. That this divorce of physical sexuality from knowing you and caring about you students are finding disappointing. Why? Because you aren't made to rip yourself apart like that. We're not built that way. You're made to be one, that your body, mind, soul are knit together. And so trying to divorce your emotions from your sexual life is a form of suffering in your life. And I don't want to see that happen for you. I don't. And so the reality is, when college students around the country are interviewed about dating, she said, far and away, they all get excited. She said, whenever dating comes up, you see excitement in college students, and I see it too. She said, when you bring it up, girls say, I would love to go on a date. I would love to be asked out. I would probably say yes. And guys say, I would love to go on a date if it wouldn't be weird to ask someone on one, which I'm afraid it would be weird. Which as I've talked about dating, so many guys have come up to me and say, I want to ask this girl out, but I'm afraid it'll be weird. Should I just walk up to her and say, hey, do you want to go to dinner? That's going to be so weird. And I said, no, that's fine. That's totally acceptable. You'll decide how weird it is. If you're like, you want to go to dinner? I was like, but if you're just like, hey, I'd love to go to dinner with you, the weirdness level goes way down. And yet in your culture today, there's this thought that it would be weird, but here's the interesting thing. When you are interviewed, almost 100% of you want that. More than just the emotionless sexual encounter. You want romance. Did you know that? The data's in on you people. Gotcha. You want romance. And when college students are interviewed about what romance is, it is remarkably chaste. It's talking, usually in an inspirational location, like a lawn or something with a cool breeze. So data that even excluded the most hyper-Christian of kids, just data on college students has found far and away, you want to be known. You want to be cared for. You want someone to commit to you. You want someone to be there for you, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love you until the end of your days. That's who you want to have sex with, and that's who you should. Right? You should. So what do? Here's what I want to make sure you all hear. Again, it's this. I don't want you to hear shame, because there's a voice in the culture today that says unrestrained sex is freedom, and when the Christian comes along and starts putting boundaries around it, they're repressive and prude and hate sex. Let me tell you something. I don't hate sex. I think it's awesome. God doesn't hate sex either. Read your Bible. Read Proverbs. Proverbs, God is telling you, young men, may the breasts of your wife satisfy you forever. That's not about reproduction. I don't know how much you've studied that. A guy enjoying a woman's breast isn't what makes babies. Ask your friends later. That's the Bible telling you to enjoy sex. God loves sex. He created it to fire your dopamine levels, that you would go, this is amazing. And he created it to be a bonding source, that you would be knit together with someone forever. What I hate is a culture that tries to divorce sexuality from that. Because what they're doing in the culture today is they are at best ignorantly presenting you a sexuality that is demonstrably stealing joy from you. At worst, they're deliberately doing it to monetize your sexuality. And I hate that. I hate it. I hate what pornography has done to you, because I see it take the joy out of so many of your eyes. I see it. And I see this sense of resolve that I guess this is the best I can do, is just sort of hook up with whoever, sort of, and you've given up on the fact that there can be something really good. And let me tell you, as someone who came from a past that has as much sexual devastation as many of you know and think you're the only one that does, let me tell you something. You can have a great marriage. You can. God does that. God loves to do that, and he wants to do that with you. God loves sex. He made it good, and he wants it like food to be put in channels that increase your joy, not decrease it. God's boundaries are freeing. It's this definition of freedom that's stealing from us relational intimacy and even the enjoyment of sex by the end of it. And I want to break that up. So what do we do? What do we do? Let me give you 3 things quickly before we go. The first thing I want to tell you is get to know your God. Get to know him. Because some of you, when you think about your sexuality, if you start thinking about spirituality, your instant thought is disappointment and shame. And I want to encourage you to read the Gospel of John. Read chapter 3, read chapter 4. As he moves towards the woman at the well, and Jesus sits with that woman, and as he begins a conversation with her, he tells her, go get your husband. She says, I don't have one. And he said, I know you don't. I know you've had multiple husbands, and I know you're living with a guy now that's not your husband. What he says to her is, I'm aware of the sexual devastation in your life. And the next thing he does is not wag his finger, is not tell her, shame on you. They were under the Mount Ebal, where the law of the Old Testament was read over the people. He doesn't point at that mountain and go, see that mountain? That's where we read the curses for those who are sinners, like you. He doesn't say that. What he says is, if you knew who was speaking to you, you would ask him, and he would give you the water that satisfies you forever. He says, you have a relational thirst. You've tried to take into broken ways of expressing relationships, and it's not working. He doesn't shame her. He offers her true satisfaction. St. Augustine, who was one of the great saints in church history, was a complete sex addict. One of his most famous prayers you hear in young people is when he prayed, oh God, make me chaste, but not yet. And yet he continued in promiscuity until it had wrung all the joy out of his life. But he was so scared to leave it behind because it was all the joy he knew. And yet he writes in his confessions, oh, how sweet it was all at once to be rid of what I once so feared to lose. You took it from me and you took their place, you who are the true sovereign joy. For many of you, you're going to pornography online or into the arms of a guy or a girl to alleviate stress, to get answers to whether or not you're lovely or acceptable or valuable. You're taking to sex questions sex isn't meant to answer. And I want to encourage you, begin a prayer life where you begin to press into God with those desires of I feel stressed, I feel insecure, I feel lost, I feel scared. Cultivate an intimacy with God rather than mindlessly taking it to the hit that sex will give. The second thing I would encourage you to do is limit the amount of images in your life that promote a soulless sexuality. Limit the amount of images in your life that promote a soulless sexuality. Naomi Wolf wrote an article for the New Yorker, and she said this: the evidence is in. Greater supply of a stimulant equals diminished capacity. She said, if you associate orgasm with your wife, with her scent and her body, over time, that's what will turn you on. If you associate it with an endless stream of sexual images, that will be what turns you on. The ubiquity of sexual images does not free your eros, it dilutes it. The reality is, what I've discovered in my own life is I want to enjoy sex with my wife. And what they're saying here is that the proliferation of sexualized image, to feast on that, doesn't increase actual sex with your beloved, it diminishes it. And so I've realized there's only one rear in the world I'm gonna touch sexually, and it's my wife's. These are the kind of things I never thought I would say on the front steps of Texas A&M. So guess what? I've decided I don't want to look at a bunch of other ones online. So I made the decision, I don't want to see the bodies of a lot of other women online. Try to limit the images that invite you to look and be enticed by someone sexually without having an actual relationship with a real person. Try to limit those, and what you will find is that they're everywhere. And what you'll find is that process of limiting is very, very hard. It's very hard. But you can do it. You can. You can begin to cut it out of your life. It's interesting. I imagine it scared some of you when I talked about that dopamine firing because of addiction to pornography or sex with your girlfriend or boyfriend. That addiction, the idea of it burning your dopamine levels and you not being able to enjoy life without it, you go, Ben, I'm too far gone. Let me give you some good news. Your mind can reset. What will happen is as you cut hypersexualized images out of your mind's gotten used to it, and what will happen is it will begin to crave it. It will begin to scream for it. It will begin to say, what are you doing? Are you insane? You're killing us. Get turned on by something, someone, anyone. That voice will begin to fire. And it's interesting. Modern science is saying that, but so was John Owen, the Puritan theologian. As he commented on the book of Romans where Paul talks about crucifying your flesh, he said, no one likes to be crucified. He says, when you put a guy on a cross and drive nails into him, he will fight you very hard. He said, but if you keep nailing him down, eventually he'll bleed out and get weaker. And I remember the first time I read that illustration, I thought, that's really grim. That's a very dark illustration. But I thought, but it's true. When you decide to kill that part of your brain that is constantly looking for stimulation sexually with people that you don't love emotionally, that part of your brain will go, what are you, nuts? Look at somebody sexually quick. And you got to go, come here, buddy, come here, stay there. Okay, all right, okay. And he is going to go ballistic. You just keep nailing him down, right? And so here's the third point. Cultivate moments in your life that promote engaging with the whole of people, not just their bodies. Some of you are far more familiar with the bodies of women online than you are with the minds and hearts of the girls that go to your church. And that needs to change. How are you going to break this cycle of over-sexual stimulation? You got to cut it out. It's like someone who's addicted to alcohol. You got to get all the alcohol out of your house. And that will mean bigger changes than some of you realize you have to make. And let me tell you something. You can't do it alone. So I didn't want to stand up here and say, sex is being used really poorly, so just no. Because what that does to you is you go, what do you do now? So I do want to tell you, cut out this pornified version of it that's being pressed on your generation. Put in its place healthy relationships with other people. For some of you, what that will mean is not the ridiculous accountability that I hear with so many Christian men and women where they say, hold me accountable to not do this thing. And then what happens is I do that thing and then I confess it to you and you go, yeah, dude, totally. And what happens is you don't actually view porn less or masturbate less or something like that. You just get more comfortable telling each other about it, right? I want to encourage you, call them earlier. You see this in all the literature about how are men going to get free from sexual addiction. No one ever does it alone. You have to cultivate relationships with the whole of people. That means when you're tempted sexually, you make a phone call, and not to someone you're tempted sexually by. Let me just call my girlfriend and maybe she'll come over. Bad call, bro. You call the guy you're not turned on by at all, right? And you say, hey, I just want to let you know, there's a little voice in my head that's ready to go crazy, and I'm starting to think he makes sense. And you let your friend be like the buddies of Ulysses as he sailed his ship past the sirens. Tie me to the mast, boys, because as we're going by, I'm about to lose it, right? And I just need someone to tie me down, and I'll thank you later, right? You need that. Let me tell you something about me. I was introduced to a lot of pornographic images as a little kid. And in college, I set up a lot of parameters around my life to brutally cut it out of my life. And I still do that. But I was surprised later in life that when stress levels would go up, this voice in my head would call me to go back to that to relieve stress, to use it like a drug. And I thought, I don't want to do that. And what I found was I could keep setting parameters, and I've set great ones. But where I've found real liberty and success is by cutting out that way of relieving stress, but putting in its place calling friends, texting buddies, going on a walk with somebody I like. Those things that are just good. They're just good. And I want to encourage you, start cultivating those kinds of relationships in your life with people that promote in you what's good, what's just good. And let's support each other. That's what the church is meant to do. It's meant to come around each other and support each other. Sex is one of the most powerful forces we've been given. It literally creates life. And it literally can be the most damaging thing you do to another human being. And so we have to help each other harness this power in a healthy way. Do it as you deal with pornography. Do it as you deal with relationships. I've told the story many times of when Donna and I were dating seriously. We had people around us who would ask us hard questions. We would date in public. We would go places where we could talk and get to know each other, where there wouldn't be this temptation to press things sexually before we were married. If we ever did stay at my apartment and watch a movie, my roommate would stay with us. My roommate's name was Justin, and his last name was Case. And so the joke was we would keep him there just in case. And people think I'm making that up, and I'm not. He's a real guy. I saw him 2 days ago. And we actually laugh every time we see each other. And do you know why? Because we remember watching a movie on the couch together, Ben and Donna and Justin, right? And it was so funny and so safe and so good and so great for us. And I want that for you. Right? Sex is a gift. It's a gift from God. There's ways to use it that promote life, and there's ways to use it that destroy life. And I want you to use it in a way that's good. It's good. That's what God's designed it to be. Right? Last thing I would say is this. I've seen something in the recovery culture as I've talked to more and more people who are helping people recover from sexual addiction. And what I've found in the recovery culture is that they are hard in the right places and soft in the right places. What do I mean by that? I mean they're hard on the externals. They set boundaries and do not deviate from them. And they are hard boundaries. If your phone is a source of temptation, give it away. Erase all of your apps. Things that seem unthinkable now, they say it's not worth sinning over. Do it. But they're also soft when it comes to identity. You are loved. You are valuable. You are cherished. You are good. Most young people I talk to get this totally opposite. You have very soft boundaries with how illicit sexuality gets into your life, and it's hurting you. And yet you're very hard on yourself, and you beat yourself up. And that's not the gospel. That's not what Christ does. The truth is, in the gospel, over and over, the Bible talks about all of us were devastated by sin. 1 Corinthians 6 speaks of this, of how so many of us have been broken in so many ways sexually. It says, but you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. You were made clean, you were made right, you are made holy by Jesus. So my hope is for you as you leave this place, none of you would feel like you live under heaven's frown or condemnation, because there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Because the law of the Spirit of life has set us free from the law of sin and death. We have a new liberty, a healthy liberty in Him. So my hope is as you walk out of here, whatever you've been a part of, whatever's happened to you or you've perpetrated, you can know you were made in God's image and have value. You are broken because of sin, but when we come to Christ, He loves, he forgives, he cleanses, and he says, you are righteous, you are good, you are holy. And if you need to look into the mirror tonight and say that to yourself 1,000,000 times, say it to yourself. I am loved, I am valuable, I am worthy, I am cherished. And say it till you mean it, because it's true. But then I invite you to take a look at your life and say, but what are some healthy conversations that need to come in? Who are some people I need to confess to? And what are some unhealthy things that need to get out? And God, give me the courage to make the hard decisions for your glory, God, and my good. And I pray that you will experience what so many have before you, that you will find a joy you may not think is even possible now, because God loves you and he has a wonderful plan for your life if you trust him.